I'm going to begin this project by basically creating the inside image for my cloche, okay? So I don't want this to shift. I'm just going to use a little bit of painter's tape to hold that still. And then take whatever you happen to have handy. It could be a pencil, it could be a pen, whatever. I'm going to go on the outer edge of the cloche. What's not as important is this like domed portion at the bottom, because we really don't need to worry about that so much. So I'm just going to kind of capture the inner part of this stencil. You can use the wet brush method if that's your preferred. Okay, so that's good. And then, like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of hit that as well. So just real simple, no big whoop, just kind of keeping it nice and easy. I'm tearing a little bit of this decoupage paper with the painter's tape, but oh well. Okay, so here we go. I have that really awesome kind of Gothic image going on there. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cut this down to size, and I'm just kind of wetting my fingers and running it on the edge of my canvas. If it's a little raggedy, I'm not worried. I just want to kind of quickly get rid of the excess. And of course you could totally sand your edge, you know, that's nothing new. Whatever you do, do not get rid of your excess ticking, because this stuff is awesome. And it's such a neutral, you know what I mean? I mean, I'm using the black one as kind of a darker sort of Victorian theme, but you do not have to waste it. You could use it again for lots of other really delightful projects. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and decoupage this down. This is nothing new. You guys have done this before, I'm sure. Just in case though, I'm going to show you how I do it. First thing I'm going to do is basically line it all up so it's nice and centered. I'm going to start off in the center and work my way out. When I'm done, I'm going to flip it and do the same thing on the other side. But I'm going to speed this up so that you're not having to kind of dredge through the whole process, okay? Bigger brush, definitely handy, and let's get rolling. Okay, so you could probably see that I was lifting up my canvas as I was finishing this off. And what I'm doing is I've got my hand behind my canvas so that I can kind of press down. You'll find that sometimes when you're decoupaging on a canvas, because it's stretched, you can't quite get a good adhesion. So I kind of just put my hand back there. And of course, you know, there's that wonderful trick where you can just take an iron and smooth out any of the wrinkles. For me, I like the wrinkles, so I typically don't worry about them too much. Okay, so that's my little trick for the back of the canvas. Okay, so I'm taping off a 1-inch border all the way around, and it's easiest to do it on 2 sides at a time, okay? I'm just going to use a regular acrylic. This happens to be Payne's Gray, but you could use black, you could use orange, you could use whatever color speaks to you. And I'm just going to go ahead and paint a nice little border all the way around. The thicker the better, that way you don't have to do 2 coats, but if your acrylic isn't terribly thick and it's not a super heavy body, then you can go ahead and just do the 2 coats. I find that Liquitex is a really, really good student grade paint. And when I say student grade, I mean the the Basics acrylic, because Liquitex does have an artist grade line, of course, but Basics is something that you find on Amazon. You can find it at your local Michael's, I think even at Joann's. It's just one of those really great and inexpensive lines that you can't go wrong with. When you pull your tape away, you're going to want to pull very carefully. Pull it towards the painted edge. I did not wait for mine to dry, so I'm just going to do this really carefully. And like I said, I want to make sure that this is nice and slow so I don't accidentally tear my decoupage paper. But if it tears, again, it's not a big deal. You know what I mean? You're making something that's kind of distressed and older looking anyway, so it's okay. But I didn't tape down and like really press hard on my tape. I just made sure that it had the nice clean edge on it. That was my objective. So I'll go ahead and dry these up, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Before I paint the sides, I'm just going to remove any of the excess tissue that may be kind of clinging on there. And you could have done this before we did the border, but it really is no big deal for me because, you know, I'm just going to paint the sides anyway. So just sand off the excess and paint all around your edge so that you have the nice black frame. And it's almost like a faux frame in essence anyway. You know what I mean? Because you've got the 1-inch border here, and then you're going to paint the side, so it'll look like it's an actual ticking put into a frame with a black border. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish off the sanding and then paint these edges the same color as the front frame. Alrighty, so my edges are nice and painted and clean. Now what I've done is I basically made myself a table lip, okay? So this is going to be where my my table is going to sit, and I'm going to lay that out in just a little bit. But right now what I want to do is kind of determine my positioning on the cloche. And I don't want to center it. I want to have it kind of off a little bit. I want this to feel like an old den of like maybe a philosopher or a scientist, and he's kind of just got his darker Victorian Gothic theme going on in the background, and it's just sort of moody and aged. So that's what I'm going for, and I want this to sit off to the side. I'm also going to, like you guys know, use this tissue on the inside. So basically it looks like a study, you know, an anatomical study to some degree. So that's going to be on the inside. And then I'll probably do some other really fun stuff on the side, like maybe some leaves or something like that, just to kind of make it feel a little bit more fall themed. So we're going to go ahead and just tape this down. And again, this is just 3 inches up from my taped border. Okay, so I just did a line of Sharpie 3 inches up. So no big deal. And I kind of just made sure that that was sitting nicely on that line. Now, the only thing I need to stencil is just this outer edge of my cloche. That's it. I don't want to go necessarily down here. I mean, I could, but I'm probably not going to. Am I? Well, maybe. Well, let's just do it. So I'm just using a little bit more of that same gray. This is more or less just kind of like a placeholder, and it will make more sense in just a little bit. So this doesn't have to be perfect stenciling, okay? You just want to kind of block out the silhouette of the cloche. And I prefer stenciling with makeup sponges. You can typically find these at your dollar store. You don't have to throw them away after you're done with one use. You just kind of cut off that little painty edge, and you can continue using them until they're just a little stump of sponge left over. Okay, so you see there's not really much to it. Alrighty, now we're going to go ahead and paint this center area with white paint or white gesso, whichever you happen to have. So our next step, this is dry, is going to be to decoupage down our little cutout. Make sure that you have that nice and centered off the way you want it to be. Don't worry if you have some of the other little lip kind of showing. We can kind of fix that with the second stencil on top, okay? So I'm going to just sort of rest my left hand and I'm going to go ahead and decoupage this down. Next up, I mixed up a warm gray. So I took my Payne's gray, I took my acrylic white, and I took a little bit of burnt umber, and then just using a palette knife, I kind of just stirred up the color that I was going for. We have a lot of really dark kind of moody colors, so sometimes you actually need to introduce something a little bit on the lighter side so that it doesn't get totally lost. So I'm gonna go ahead and just paint this in. Kind of carefully go around the edge of my cloche. If you want to, you can even retape your border again, just so that you don't accidentally get any in the border. I tend to distress everything towards the end of my project anyway, so I really don't worry about it. If there are any little boo-boos, it's sort of easy to fix them. All right, so right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bit of an aging effect for myself. And I've just sprayed water into my acrylic. It's really important that I get a really opaque version of this. So I'm really stirring my acrylic into the water, okay? But it has to be the right consistency as well for what we're gonna do. I'm gonna splatter, but for splatter, you need to have almost like a melted milkshake consistency with acrylic. So I'm kind of just prepping this so that that water and acrylic is thoroughly mixed together, okay? Now I want to come down to a slightly smaller brush. I don't want to use that big wash. I'm going to go with something that's kind of like around 5, all right? Roughly 3, 5, any of those would be good. I'm also going to wet this brush with water and I'm going to start splatting. So I'm just going to stir in here again. And I'm just going to create some splatter and some textural interest on my surface. I don't want it to be too flat. Okay, and then I'm going to come in, pick up that same big brush I used earlier. I didn't rinse it off all the way. It's got water on it. And some of this I'm just going to kind of blend with my brush a little bit. I'm really big on using my finger and like rags and whatever you happen to have kind of floating around. But I'm sort of using this texture that we created with our tissue and everything. And it's almost like a faux wood type of effect when I drag that, my fingers right through that splatter. So you end up with kind of the right amount of lines of this faux wood type of thing going on because they've fallen very organically. So like I said, I'm just kind of dragging my hand from left to right to create that kind of faux wood effect. All right, I like that. I'm gonna leave it be, but I do want some splatter to be visible. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that one more time, but this time I'm gonna be a little bit more mindful of where those splatters land and just how many there are. Okay, so go ahead and dry that up. So we have our perfectly finished little floorboard basically down there, or tabletop surface, all dried up. Now if you notice, this white knob doesn't look quite natural, so what we're going to do is we're going to tie it in, but at the same time we're also going to make everything feel cohesive and kind of age it to some degree. So what I'm using is Tsukuneko Walnut Ink Crystals, and I will zoom in here. Tsukuneko is Tsukineko, and I just mix in like maybe 1/4 of a teaspoon into a small little spritzer like this and use hot water, give it a good shake, and then I can use it as a really awesome stain. It is water soluble, so you do have to be careful that you don't accidentally reactivate in areas that you don't want to reactivate, if that makes any sense. So you can already see this gave me some wonderful aging in there. I can kind of come in and blot a little bit. I can go back in and add just a smidge more, but again, it's starting to feel very cohesive. And then what I'll do is kind of down here, I'll also hit a little bit of my piece so that this is all feeling like it was all one piece all along. I'm gonna hit that one more time, and I'll just sort of blot off around that. I like having big splats and little splats. Just the mixture of it is really appealing to the eye. If you wanted to go ahead and hit down here, you totally could too. I say down here and I was even off camera, so that didn't do any good. So I'm just gonna kind of blot, and then I'm gonna go ahead and speed dry this entire thing. Okay, so everything on my background is dry. I laid my stencil back on top so that I can reintroduce all of the detail. One of the things that I want to be conscientious of is you do not want to hit this portion here, because essentially what you have is this skull on the book in the background, and that would not be showing if you had that in there, okay? So you just kind of have to think about these things as you're doing them, just so that, you know, they make some sense to you. I went ahead and grabbed black this time, not gray, but black. That way all of my details really, really pop. So I laid out some black on my palette. I have my sponge loaded and ready to go. And I'm just going to carefully pounce all of the detail from the cloche back in. Now, on the first round, we were focusing largely on the silhouette of the cloche. This time we want to capture all of the details, including like the reflection line in there, all of that good stuff. Okay, so from here, we're going to do some blending. We want to make sure that all of this starts to feel more cohesive, as well as not quite so like blocked out. So with a stencil, you're always going to have a really perfect edge, and you really don't want that when you want this to look more painterly. So I'm just putting a little bit of white paint on my size 5 round, and I'm going to start kind of coming in on the edges of my stencil and kind of just softening them out. This is not a ton of white acrylic paint. All I'm doing is softening the edge of my stenciled line. At the same time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little bit of reflection. So you're just kind of changing the value a little bit. I really, really like this wonderful walnut stain in there, so I'm not going to do anything with that. But what I'll do is, just to kind of make it interesting, I'll add a little line of white, almost like it's catching some light right there on the lip, on that little bulbed edge of the cloche. I just use my finger to kind of blend in the paint. If your paint is not gliding nice and easy off, you can always wet your brush just a little bit. Just make sure it's not too wet. Now, if you remember, we sprayed walnut stain on this piece. It is water soluble, so it will activate again with water or any kind of moisture. So there's a good chance that as you're doing this, you're going to probably be reactivating some of the brown, which is really, really cool because again, it's just gonna look even more aged and kind of perfect the way we're kind of going for. Just softening up all my edges. More crisp white here just to kind of make that reflection even more clear. I'll even do a little bit more reflection there at the top of the cloche. From here, I'm going to spritz a little water into my white acrylic, same as we did with the brown acrylic earlier, so that I can go ahead and splat some white. I'm just kind of trying to keep that mostly in the cloche. So if you happen to get a little bit of white splatter on the outer portion, just take your towel and kind of just wipe it up. The little white smudgy effect that you get when you pick it up is another great little distressing, so it's not a bad thing. Now I can tell that on the part of the skull, this was originally a reflection of light as well. So if I just take my white acrylic and kind of just reintroduce some of those highlights in the skull's face, those begin to look really dimensional. Don't go too crazy. It's so fun. You're going to want to do more, trust me. But more is definitely less when it comes to adding the reflection back in. Or did I say more is less? Less is more. All right, so a little more splatter. Perfect. Now I do want to soften up my edges on the outside of this cloche a little bit too. So I'm just going to kind of on the outer edge throw that down. Not on all of it, just a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and dry that up. I want to introduce some more dimensional details and interest to the tabletop of our desk. So I'm just going to kind of rip off, and I'm just using the straight edge of my ruler to create almost like a document that's going to be peeking up from the bottom of my tabletop. And that actually just ripped in the wrong spot, so you can always cut it. I'm just kind of lazy and I like a torn edge, generally speaking, so that's why I'm doing the ruler. And it kind of breaks my heart kind of not using the entire moth, but if it was like an actual den or study, it wouldn't be a surprise to see like an entomology study or something like that on the desk, you know what I mean? So we don't necessarily need the entire thing. Now let's see how much of that we really want in there. I'm kind of hoping that this will look like, you know, it's sort of peeking up on his work surface. So I know that's a little too high. I'm gonna go ahead and come a little lower. That's about right. You might want to tear this. I mean, cut this. I really want it to be kind of angled. I don't want it to be perfect up and down kind of thing. All right, let's go ahead and decoupage that down. I want some additional details, and I just happen to love like specimens and anything like scientific. It's totally my jam. So I picked this up a few years ago. It's called Field Notes, and the actual number is CMS 396. It's a Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous stamp. I don't know if they still make it or not, but there are a lot of stamps like this on the market. So what I wanted to do was give myself a couple of extra elements to kind of add on to, and I also found this old pen, which I thought, okay, that's really stinking cool. So I think I'm going to use that too. But what I'm going to do is use some of the tissue that's left over from Royce's piece that we pulled this from, and I'm just going to stamp out some of these little field label notes onto it. So let me go ahead and just shift this over because it's in my way. And you can use my favorite ink, again, because it's fast drying. It's Ranger's Archival ink. It's what I use for watercolor and that sort of thing too. I'm a really impatient crafter. I really don't want to have to wait for things to dry, so yeah, that's why I use this ink particularly. So I'm just going to go ahead and stamp that out. When you heat set it, you make it permanent, so I'll go ahead and heat set that real quick and cut it out. remember how I told you that I felt kind of bad cutting the moth. I might end up using the other piece on the tablecloth, because if this is in fact a scientist who's kind of doing his field study or whatever, he could have his little field label here, and then maybe some of the moth wing is hanging off on the side over here. So I'm going to cut some of that moth out, and we'll see if that actually works for us as well. And that's 1, 2, 3. Ooh, so if I add a 4th element, maybe the 5th is my cloche. So I'm gonna go ahead and do something like that. I'm gonna stamp this pen on some more tissue as well. Okay, so you have a bit of a story. You have a scientist or some sort of an old doctor in a Gothic den somewhere. He's reading his medical journal with his pen. Has a little bit of an entomology hobby, so he's got his little moth and his field label off over here. So it's a story. Telling the story makes a huge difference when it comes to creating these really fun assemblage pieces. Now we have a lot going on up here, and you might be thinking, well, gosh, I really want to put something up here. Part of this is supposed to look like the wallpaper of an old den, so I'm not going to go crazy and put something back here, but you could do like a little framed element up here. What I am going to do is add a piece up at the top, which gives me a 3-dimensional frame effect with a would you bend flourish element at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and paint it, and we'll adhere it to the top. So I got this awesome little element here. This is from Would You Bend, and we have a really great we have a really great distributor here in the States, Would You Bend USA West, and Sunny heads that up. So she actually gave everybody at Roycycled Treasures Retreat a little sample packet of Would You Bend. So I'm super excited about being able to use this for the first time. For those of you guys who have never used it before, it does heat up and bend. You can put it over a concave surface, which is redonkulous. Love that. For our purposes today, though, we are just going to paint it the same color as the rest of our frame, okay? So I'm just gonna bust out some of that same Payne's Gray. I will more than likely have to paint a couple of coats on it, but then I'm gonna distress it so that it looks nice and old once I distress my picture as well. And this is actually the first time I'm using Would You Bend. So, you know, it's one of those things where when you're painting on a substrate or something new, you don't know what to expect if you're gonna have to do 2 coats or something like that. So far, this is actually taking the paint really nicely. And because it's that kind of a craft brown color, it's really cool. Plus, it's really porous. So it's not like working with resin where you know you have to kind of prime it, or you have to wait for your acrylic to dry and then do a second coat on it and it slides all over the place. Which, don't get me wrong, I love resin. Have been using it for years, but sometimes you don't want to have to go through all of that hullabaloo just to get coverage on something. And these have wonderful details. I'm surprisingly happy. That's 1 coat. I didn't even have to do 2 coats, and it looks awesome. So I'm just gonna go ahead and leave that be. And I marked the center of this piece up at the top so that I can line this little corner element in the center up with my frame. And that will give my frame this faux frame type of thing. It's actually a really perfect class project too, you guys, because, you know, everybody likes a piece of framed art. It just looks good that way. So I'm gonna go ahead and use some Titebond to secure this on. You don't need a ton, just a little bit to kind of gum it on. And there's also a lot of this, particularly at the top center, that's kind of hanging off of the frame itself. Love Tight Bond. This adhesive is the bomb. So I'm going to kind of do this little push up and push down type of situation. And you can come in and like clean up your glue with a wet brush. If you have any kind of squeeze out. It does dry clear, but you know, nobody really wants to see all of the gooey glue kind of showing through. All right, and then stand up right over it to make sure that it is in fact nice and centered. You might want to consider putting something underneath that little lip to kind of support as it's drying, but usually after a few seconds it takes hold really well, so it's not a big deal. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and let that dry. While that piece is drying, I'm also going to go ahead and come over here and sort of distress and age up my frame edges. Less or more, depending on your preference. You can even, if you're careful, kind of come in and accidentally age up and hit some of the edges of the wood you bend, so it looks like a legit old frame, you know. Totally love doing that. All right, so there you have it, folks. We have our faux frame of our scientific study using the 2022 Halloween Project Blocks Roycycled Treasures tissue and the brand spanking new stencil that she came up with, the cloche. So I hope you guys enjoyed the exercise and have an absolute blast coming up with your own little story. And I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Have a good one. Bye.